It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 68. Hello and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to professional wrestling from 1870 to 1930. And in this episode, I'll talk about the development of the normal St. Louis promotion in the early 1920s, but this will be a solo episode. And I apologize for the lateness in getting it out over the past 2 weeks. Dan came home, and then he went back into the hospital again. My wife also had a major medical procedure, and now I have caught a cold. So I also apologize. This week's episode probably might be a little short, as I'm going to go as long as my voice will hold out. But it's not been a couple weeks without challenges, so I appreciate your patience, and we're going to get back to a normal schedule and a normal show as quickly as we possibly can. I was going to, well, I'm still going to, as long as my voice holds out. I'm going to review the Mr. McMahon series that was on Netflix. And that will be the review for this week's episode. Bad Blood pay-per-view or premium live event came out in early October, and I will say overall I thought the card was pretty good, but I don't have time to review the card, nor do people really like the modern wrestling, I think, as much as the classical wrestling or the historical wrestling. I will say that I highly recommend the match between CM Punk and Drew McIntyre. The match could have held up at any era. Wasn't a whole lot of high flying. They did gimmick it up with some of the weapons, but at least the things that they used were things that would normally be underneath a wrestling ring, as opposed to the kendo sticks. They almost lost me for a very brief time because McIntyre pulled out what I thought was a bag of thumbtacks, but it turned out that there was something else that made a lot more sense for the storyline, and I really recommend that. That's probably the best match I've seen on WWE this year, which probably means it's the best match I've seen so far, because I haven't seen anything anywhere else that really blew me away. So, and one of the reasons why it's my favorite match is it told a good story. That's the kind of match you would expect to be the climax of a big blood feud by two people who didn't like each other. I will say I'm still not a fan of people juicing themselves, but I also understand how it's very hard to have a cage match, particularly a Hell in a Cell, and there's no blood at all. You know, it strains credibility. But I've said many times that there's way too much juicing in pro wrestling, because people know that the athletes are cutting their heads now. And you've got a whole social stigma around kids cutting themselves and that I don't think that it's a good idea, particularly with sponsors and everything else that you have to consider as, you know, major national companies. And I think there would be a better off if WWE and AEW did a lot less of it. It made sense in this match, though, so I can't take too much away from that. The only other update I have is Shooter in a Worked World is now available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, hardcover, and audiobook. And when I started that project, I thought that Pesek had settled a couple promotional wars in the legitimate contests he wrestled. But actually, he settled a promotional war, he started a promotional war, and he double-crossed the world champion. So, if you want to read about one of the greatest legitimate submission wrestlers in the history of professional wrestling, Shooter in a Worked World, John Pesek in the 1920s promotional wars, is available on Amazon. So let's hop right into the history topic this week while my voice is still cooperating with me. So prior to 1921-22, they did have not regular wrestling, but professional wrestling matches occurred in St. Louis. In fact, a couple of days before Stanislaw Sabisco wrestled Frank Gotch in June 1910, he wrestled a match against Charlie Olson, the very skilled light heavyweight wrestler, in St. Louis as the last match prior to the contest he had with Gotch in 1910. And Burner McFadden, who went on to be one of the early proponents of physical culture and an early publisher, sort of in the Joe Weider mode. Joe Weider probably took a lot of inspiration for his career from Burner McFadden. But McFadden, who was born in mid-Missouri, moved to St. Louis as a teenager, and besides working odd jobs to help facilitate his publishing and physical culture career, McFadden was also a professional wrestler in the 1880s, 1890s in St. Louis. So they did have professional wrestling, but there wasn't a regular promotion here. Like most wrestling that occurred, it was either it was a spot show for like a Chicago promotional office, and actually when St. Louis starts in 1921, it is local organizers working with the Chicago office for the first few months before John Contos takes over the promotion and develops really the first St. Louis-based promotion. Prior to that, the other big matches in St. Louis were always either backers who were supporting McFadden and would pay for the matches because they wanted to see him wrestle, and a lot of times they lost their shirt on the actual matches. That was really common in the 19th century, was to have the manager get organizers or get a backing of an athletic club. So St. Paul Athletic Club, I think it was Dan McLeod, they sponsored for quite a while. But the Empire Club in Chicago, these sporting clubs would sponsor the matches. Sometimes they made money, sometimes they didn't. The wrestlers and managers usually made most of the money in those. In 1921, Ed White is running the Chicago promotion, and they start working with local St. Louis businessmen to put on wrestling shows. And the very first show that they have is in St. Louis in December of 1921, and it's a 3-match card headlined by Jim Londos. And Londos would go on to be a huge star in St. Louis, and St. Louis would kind of be his base of operations in the 20s, and that would cement a lifetime partnership between Londos and Tom Pax, who was a St. Louis promoter after Contos, which we'll get there in a second. But Contos nor Pax is involved with this initial promotion in December 1921. And the local organizers rent the Odeon Theater, which was a theater at North Grand and Finney Avenue. And this was just a local vaudeville theater, live performance theater, and eventually they converted to a movie house. But it always had a stage. It always could do live performances as well. The theater itself probably had a seating capacity in the high hundreds, maybe 1,000. And they drew 400 fans to the first card, which, when you look at it in the 19-teens and 1920s, the crowds were usually in the thousands, not the hundreds, but you're starting a new town, basically. And so those initial cards, you're getting the really diehard fans, and those are usually smaller. As the buzz around the promotion builds, then you start getting into the thousands. And Tom Pax normally drew to the Coliseum about 7,000 to 9,000 fans, which is about what Sam Muchnick did with Kiel Auditorium years later. And in fact, 4 years after this match, where they drew 400 people, Tom Pax drew 17,000 fans to the St. Louis University field, their stadium, to see the Zbyszko, Stanislaus Zbyszko, Joe Stecher match. This was the match after Zbyszko double-crossed Big Wayne Munn in Philadelphia in April of 1925. May 30th, 1925, Joe Stecher wrestled Stanislaus Zbyszko in St. Louis at the St. Louis University field in front of 17,000 plus fans, and Zbyszko drops the title to Stecher in the planned end to that double cross. Zbyszko beat Munn at the behest of the Stechers and a group of promoters, always with the intention that he was going to drop the belt to Stecher a month later. So the initial cards are at the Odeon Theater. When John Contos takes over the promotion in mid-1922, he will take and move the matches to the St. Louis Coliseum, which was a building at the corner of Jefferson and Washington in St. Louis that was built in 1909, and it was one of the largest indoor venues in the country when it was built. The 1916 Democratic National Convention was held at the Coliseum. And another change that Contos would make from this original card, in this original card, they just put mats on the stage. So in the 19th century, early 20th century, a lot of the wrestling matches did not occur in rings like boxing did. That started to transition in the 19-teens, and definitely by the mid-20s, almost all pro wrestling is done in rings, although I've heard that there were some cards in the South that were still using mats on top of stages. But this first card in St. Louis at the Odeon was up on the stage, and it was just mats. They would also use heavy carpets in the 19th century, so it could be a mat, could be a carpet. They have the same setup here at this very first match, but that's one of the first things Contos changes, is he moves it to the Coliseum. And then they start wrestling in a wrestling ring pretty quickly after that. Landis is the headliner for this card, and he wrestles he wasn't a local St. Louis wasn't a local St. Louis wrestler, but he was a wrestler from the Midwest named Joe Mantell. I think he normally wrestled out of Chicago. And Mantell was more a local wrestler. Landis, even now, had a national reputation, although Landis was losing all the big matches he had with the Pesics, with Stecher, with Ed Strangler Lewis. He did not develop into the greatest box office attraction of all time until mid-late 20s, early 30s. But in this match, he beats the guy he's wrestling in 2 straight falls. So, the first fall took him about 44 minutes, where Landis won with a head chancery and clutch. And after that, he didn't feel like he needed to carry the guy too much longer to make him look good. So he only needed 14 minutes to take the second fall with a flying mare. Landis won the match in 2 straight falls, and they gave the fans an hour, which was, they felt good return for their money. And they had 2... one went 15, one went 20, and they were lighter wrestlers, a middleweight and a lightweight. I have to keep pausing this recording to cough. So if you hear a little bit of a pause, it's probably meant I had to pause it to cough. But the first card is a success. And so they booked Landis to come back in January at the Odeon, and they drew double the crowd that they had the first time. And like I said, by the mid of 1922, John Contos takes over the promotion. They move it to the Coliseum. John Contos, when he takes over the promotion, is aided by his nephew, who is a gentleman by the name of Tom Pax. And Tom Pax is the St. Louis promoter before Sam Muchnick. Contos had a good local promotion in St. Louis, he hosted several world title matches between Strangler Lewis and Stanislaus Zbyszko. But it really took off under the promotion of Tom Pax. And Tom Pax built relations with the athletic commissions. Tom Pax built relationships with other promoters around the United States. He could get on the phone with Jack Curley or George Toohey and later Paul Bowser in Boston, whoever was running Chicago at the time, and he could make deals. So he became a power broker in professional wrestling, which really helped the development of Jim Londos, because Londos was Pax's biggest star. Pax was very invested in Londos' career, and Pax helped grease the wheels for Londos to start wrestling more in New York and Boston, Philadelphia, but to also start winning those matches. Prior to that, he had been losing the matches to the big names like Pesek, Stecker, Lewis. Now, Londos was winning some of those matches. And by the 30s, Londos in Chicago drew 34,000 to see him wrestle Ed Strangler Lewis, and that was the biggest wrestling match in the United States, not just Chicago, in the United States, since Gotch versus Hackenschmidt, the second match in Chicago on Labor Day 1911. That match drew over 30,000 fans too, but fans were so disgusted at the outcome of that second Gotch-Hackenschmidt match that they did not. It really hurt pro wrestling for a couple decades afterwards, and they wouldn't start drawing 30,000 fans again until the 1930s. And the one that drew a lot of that was Londos. And Londos went to Greece, and he drew 100,000 fans to football stadiums. If you go on YouTube and you search for Jim Londos versus Kola Koriani, they wrestled in Greece, and the stadium holds 100,000. Now, I don't know if it's 100,000 like Vince used to claim for WrestleMania 3's 93,000, but you look and you see how many empty seats were there. There weren't many, and that's a 100,000 seat soccer stadium. So you make your own call, but that video is online on YouTube, and you could take a look at it. Eventually, Pax would build St. Louis into a national power, and it was one of the top cities in the country for a long time. Not only did Stanislaus Zbyszko drop the belt to Stecker in St. Louis in 1925, but when Lewis and Stecker finally agreed to settle the promotional war and to reunify the title, they held that match, which was a legitimate contest, at least it started that way. That match occurred in St. Louis in February of 1928, and it occurred in St. Louis because both factions would not agree to any other location but St. Louis. We kind of went through that pretty quickly, but forgive me, my voice is going, so I want to get this review of Mr. McMahon, and we're probably only going to have a 30-minute episode this time, but when we have our next episode, I'm sure Dan will be rabbiting on, and we'll cover a lot more ground. So the Mr. McMahon documentary. I wanted to do this review a couple of weeks ago, right after I'd seen it, before I'd heard other reviews of it, but the episode I had recorded I didn't like, and I deleted. And so I've heard others' takes on it. I don't think it's really going to affect my take on it because I haven't heard anything that really changes my mind about how I saw the documentary. Number one, it definitely was not a hit piece. Now, I'm sure Vince McMahon didn't like it because it doesn't make him look like the white knight that saved the wrestling business. But at the same time, I thought it gave a fair and as accurate a portrayal of him as you can give. I know Bruce Pritchard was not happy about it in the 6th episode and complained that they didn't show some of the more good things that Vince did, which I think they did show several of the good things that Vince did. And who knows what Bruce saw when he was making his comments, but he said, you didn't tell this kind of story. And he told the story about, which is true. Everybody says this exact happened. And Bruce is very grateful, which everyone could understand. Bruce's wife got cancer like 24, 25 years ago. And they had given her less than 5 years to live. But Vince made sure she had the best medical care possible. And she's still alive 25 years later. And Bruce is very grateful, which is understandable. They did include that in because they kept that in. So it wasn't like they were just trying to paint him as this evil sexual deviant. They were trying to give a fair view of, and this documentary came off like Vince himself. He's fascinating. He's troubling. You could see some of the bad things that happened to Vince and how they shaped him, but it explains some of his later behavior. It doesn't excuse it, because there are other people that go through the similar things that Vince went through that I'm sure were horrific. I have some experience with a dysfunctional family, and my relationship with my father and stepfather was the exact opposite of Vince's. I had a troubled relationship with my natural father, but my stepdad is the greatest guy you'd possibly come across, and he was a father to me and my two sisters. So we kind of had what Vince went through in reverse. And, seeing all the violence when you're a kid definitely does something to you. But again, it explains some of his future behavior. It doesn't excuse it. And obviously his father not being very demonstrative, never talking about why he was not there for the first 12 years of Vince's life, what he knew about the abuse that was going on. Those definitely left scars, and they left demons that Vince, had to confront. Doesn't excuse his later behavior, though. And one of the things that really struck me, and he's taken a lot of criticism for being AEW's chief apologist, but I think it's absolutely ludicrous when people say that Dave Meltzer is on AEW's payroll. It's just the kind of wrestling he likes. And he has kind of hurt his journalistic credibility by some of the things he's defended. But I've noticed even lately, even he's coming out and saying, you got to right the ship. You're losing too many fans. And he was right on the rights renewal deal. But I thought Dave Meltzer was exceptional in this documentary. David Shoemaker didn't really say a whole lot that I disagreed with, as he has in previous documentaries I've seen. At the same time, he's kind of a talking head that they use in a lot of the documentaries. But I thought Dave was excellent in this. Really pointing out, being the fact checker, I guess, for some of the things that were said, because WWE, as everyone knows, has a habit of they want to try to rewrite history the way they want everybody to see history. And I thought Dave did a great job being fair, but counterpointing some of the things. And he came off extremely well in this. Bret Hart came off extremely well in it. Tony Atlas came off as somebody you just don't care anymore, and hey, I'm to tell it the way I see it. Hulk Hogan, who I have been highly critical of, was as truthful as I have ever seen him in a documentary. He admitted on video that he is the one that went to Vince about Jesse Ventura trying to start the union, which everybody in the world has known, but I don't think he's ever admitted to it before. But he said, yeah, I was 100% in Vince's corner at that time. And when I heard about that, I ran right to Vince. And I was like, for Hogan, that was a heck of an admission, because everybody suspected it before, and now everybody knows it. And I'm sure that didn't help his standing with his former peer group, that he was the one that stooged to Vince about the union. But again, I thought he was fairly truthful. And I thought that the documentary did a good job of showing how Vince had a vision, and he saw the changes in cable television that were going to change the way wrestling was done from the years of the territory, which that is lionized or idealized in a way that it really wasn't, because even during the territory days, they didn't always cooperate. They would have infighting amongst themselves. When Fred Kohler got a national show, the NWA kind of turned against him, and he'd been one of the earliest members. You know, when the Sheik and Bruiser had their war, and then when Jerry Jarrett and Nick Goulas had their falling out. You know, this was not all harmony and everybody getting along and everybody cooperating. You know, Vern Gagne breaks off and starts his own promotion. The WWF breaks off and crowns their own world champion, which one of the major things the NWA was formed to do was one world champion and don't create titles that would confuse people about who the world champion is. That's one of the main reasons people got mad at Fred Kohler, because Kohler realized they were never going to put the title on Vern Gagne, and did he realize it? That's probably an overstatement, but he realized they weren't going to put the title on Vern Gagne anytime soon, and they created the U.S. title, which Sam Muchnick wasn't happy about, because he said it created confusion about who the world champion is. All that being said, the Vince McMahon had this vision, and then he went out through predatory practices at times and put all of those promotions out of business, except for Crockett. And Crockett could have survived if he wouldn't have done himself in. Vince understood business a lot better than all the other promoters, including Jim Crockett, and that's what helped him survive for so long. So it was kind of hilarious in the 1990s when Vince, who had put all the promotions, these family-owned businesses, out of business in the 80s, is talking about, Billionaire Ted's trying to crush this small family-owned business, ignoring the fact that that's what he had done the previous decade. And I thought Bischoff had a couple of really telling points during this show about that period of time and how he was messing with Vince and how Vince actually sold one or two things, which was not in his makeup to do. So that was all pretty good. And then you get to Vince's relationship with his kids. And I don't think I realized, I knew it was dysfunctional. I don't think I realized how dysfunctional it could be between Vince and Shane. And it seems like Vince is trying to do, or tried to do with Shane, what his father did with him. But his father didn't really do that with him. Shane comes off as the nice guy, the victim in all of this. And Vince comes off as, someone who is messing with his son and knows how bad he wants it. But I think Vince looked at Shane as being too nice, like everybody else in wrestling was saying how nice of a guy he was. And instead of working with him, Vince put him through some silly tests. And, the way Vince would talk about, Shane didn't have the money to buy UFC, and it was my money and all that. That's not the way, I've got 3 kids and 2 grandkids. It's not the way normally fathers talk about their children. If my son came to me with an idea to buy something, if I didn't think it was a good idea, we would talk about why it was. I wouldn't just go, I'm not jackhammer and I got the money and you don't. So, and that to me is what tells more about Vince than anything else. Vince has this vision of himself in his mind, and he projects that all the time. As his son-in-law said, you're going to see what he wants you to see. And he carries that into every area of his life. And it's a shame because Stephanie seems to have navigated it well, but he and Shane don't seem to have navigated it as well. So Shane comes off looking great. This was one of the before we get into all of the allegations that have made Vince the pariah that he is today, I think that episode 5 that showed the relationship he has with Shane did more to hurt Vince and make Vince again look like the heel. You know, he thought he was going to be the face when he and Brett had their issues. But he wasn't, and he's definitely not the face here. And his own words and how he talked about interacting with his son are what make him look like a dysfunctional father in this documentary. And then last, they get into the allegations of Vince, but there was something back in episode 2 before they got into the stuff in episode 6 that really troubled me. And I don't want to give away too many things because I don't want bad guys to know how people catch them in their subterfuge and their deceptions. But when you're interviewing someone and you accuse them of something heinous, you expect from an innocent person angry denials. You know, if you just accuse somebody of something vile like raping somebody, they're going to get mad if they're innocent. If they're not, you know, that's usually a big tell. And when they're talking about these allegations, and granted these allegations are 20, 30 years old at this point in time, but when they talk to him, he answers it, but he trails off. And then he comes back with this second point that I really, it reinforced to me why women do not come forward when this kind of stuff happens to them. So it was the Rita Chatterton allegations from the late 1980s, early 1990s. She was a referee, the first female referee in WWE, and she alleged Vince had forced her into sexual relations in the back of a limo with the promise of a very lucrative long-term contract. And the only thing that people have pointed out over the years is the number she throws around. She probably should have known that that was a pipe dream, but I don't doubt that Vince could have promised her all of this stuff because he had somebody that basically didn't have many qualifications. He was wanting to make her a vice president that he was having a relationship with. But this was not a relationship. Rita Chatterton alleged from the very beginning that it was forced. And she went on a talk show and was talking about it, and some of the people were questioning her, like, well, what do you want out of this? And I remember, I don't think the allegations she made at the time were widely believed, and that's probably why women don't come forward, because now they asked Vince about it, and he said, oh, well, you know, that was all consensual. And if it wasn't, the statute of limitations ran out. If it was a rape, that statute of limitations ran out a long time ago. Okay, that's not what innocent people say. Innocent people don't bring up statute of limitations. Or, you know, if it was a rape, the statute of limitations of... Well, at the end of that episode... So, if I was an investigator and he made an answer like that to me, I would have been honed in on that with a lot of follow-up questions. That's not how an innocent person normally reacts to a question like that. But at the end of that episode... They said when New York removed the statute of limitations during the Me Too movement, Vince made a multi-million-dollar settlement with Rita Chatterton. So first I want to say, great, Rita. I'm glad you finally got a little bit of justice. And I think everybody that didn't really believe you owes you a big apology. And then we get into the modern-day allegations and the multi-million-dollar payouts to women. And, you know, Vince still claiming he's innocent. I believed most of the things I heard from the women. There's too much of a track record here of payoffs and NDAs and everything else. You're not paying millions of dollars to people if there wasn't some kind of impropriety going on. So it'll all come out in court. We'll find out what really happened one day, or as close to it as we possibly can. And Vince will never get his reputation. He's not going to live long enough to get his reputation back if he lives to be 100. Because he's not going to come out of this smelling like a rose. And I'm sure he thinks that he's going to defend himself out of these allegations. But look back on every time, and this the one thing this documentary did, it did a great job of showing how Vince performs when he's defending himself against these things. Whether it was the Donahue show, whether it was being with Armin Gatayan or Bob Costas, Vince does not do well. He's going to say what he's going to say, but he does not do well defending himself. His best strategy is to keep his mouth shut and let his lawyers do all the arguing for him. So it's a 6-part series. It's probably between 5 and 6 hours, and it's well worth the watch. Vince, Tony Etla said it best, Vince is the greatest professional wrestling promoter of all time, bar none. No one has done with professional wrestling in a professional wrestling company what Vincent Kennedy McMahon has done. However, his legacy is tarnished by all of the things that he did outside of it. And the other thing that always struck me is Vince always wanted to do this. The pro wrestling company is his life. Yet he always seemed to be a bit embarrassed by it. The sports entertainment thing was because he didn't want to call it professional wrestling. And he did all these other business ventures where he lost millions and millions of dollars trying to prove that he could do something other than be a professional wrestling promoter, and they all failed miserably. The one thing he did better than anybody else was promote professional wrestling. So watch the series, make your own judgments, see what you think. And I think Vince will always remain a fascinating yet controversial figure, and that his legacy is going to be forever marred by the last 10 to 15 years of his running of the company. With that, I think I'm going to end this episode. My voice is held out, which I'm grateful for. If you like the episode, please let others know, like, subscribe. And on our next episode, I'm going to discuss a match that I had read somewhere. I'm hoping to find the place that I had read it. I had read about a match that was supposedly a double cross, and whether I think it actually was a double cross or not. This is a match from 1931, I believe. And it's a match between Carl Poello, who was the longtime manager of Maurice Tillet, the French Angel, and Zandor Szabo, who was never an NWA National Wrestling Alliance world champion, but he held world championships in other organizations. So that'll be next week's episode. So until then, everybody, take care. Bye-bye.